the Medical AI Podcast.
Hello, I'm Dr. Felix Beacher, and this is the Medical AI Podcast, a 30-minute thrill ride of big ideas. We talk to a range of top guests, from industry innovators to scientists to philosophers. This is brought to you by Omdia and Informatech, where I'm the head of healthcare technology. Can AI systems outperform human radiologists in diagnosing cancer? If so, why don't we see such systems in clinical practice? What does the future hold? Would you rather be assessed by a human physician or an algorithm? It's a huge pleasure to be speaking with Dr. Antony Rix, co-founder and CEO of Lucida Medical. Lucida is an example of a small company breaking into AI-based medical imaging. So first, Antony, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell us maybe a little bit about yourself and how life brought you to where you are now?
Thank you very much, Felix. So I've always been interested in AI, and it's always fascinated me how it could improve the way we solve a whole load of real-world problems. 30 years ago, I went to Cambridge to study it as an undergraduate, and had the pleasure of working with some of the real kind of foundational greats in the field that we now call AI, and then did a PhD in the subject and was lucky enough to hit upon a problem that we could solve quite well, measuring the quality of telephone calls, of all things. So nowadays, if you use a mobile phone network or an internet voice service, there's a good chance that the quality of that system might actually have been assessed using the technology that I developed in my PhD, and that allowed me to build my first startup. Fast forward another 15 years, and I was looking 4 years ago in 2018 for my next kind of key challenge. And after learning about medical devices and knowing a lot of people who'd suffered from cancer, I decided to see if I could apply my AI experience to tackling one of healthcare's greatest problems.
Okay, thank you. So Lucida Medical is a really interesting example of a small company breaking into medical AI. Could you introduce it?
Yeah, sure. So Lucida Medical focuses on developing AI to help find cancer in MRI scans. MRI is great. It's non-invasive. It's very safe, and it's now pretty ubiquitous. You know, most medium-sized towns will have an MRI scanner. And what's been really intriguing is that medicine has found ways over the last 20 years of using MRI to allow you to actually visualize abnormalities inside the body and find cancer. And the vision behind the company is all about that, creating this software that makes us better, because my goodness, we need it.
And what gap does your product address?
Um, so really, we're helping to solve a long-term problem and a short-term problem. The short-term problem is that, as we all know, healthcare systems are greatly overstretched, and if we look at how cancer is being diagnosed, we're really struggling to deliver the services at the moment. And we've got a specific opportunity in prostate cancer and chose to focus on that, specifically because there's a need now to deal with the COVID backlog of prostate cancer patients. We know that radiology can find prostate cancer using imaging, but that only the really best elite and super experienced radiologists can kind of do it quickly and easily and accurately. And what we're trying to do there is kind of distill their expertise and make it available to everybody. There is a longer term goal, and that is that if we can really make this work and make screening for disease non-invasively using MRI better, we've got the potential to find a whole basket of different cancers using using AI, and we need that desperately because right now we find cancer far, far too late. About half of us will develop cancer in our lives, and about half of those cancers are found when they're advanced, locally advanced or metastatic, and survival rates are not great in that situation. If you can find cancer earlier, then it gives us a chance to completely cure it.
So, why did you choose prostate cancer in particular as a focus?
The need here is really pressing. Prostate cancer is the most common male cancer in the developed world. It affects about 1.4 million a year were diagnosed in the run up to COVID. About 4 to 5 million a year worldwide go through the process of diagnosis. Historically, we only found about 50% of prostate cancers using the traditional screening test. Using MRI, we can make it a lot more accurate. But today, hospitals are struggling to roll that out. They're struggling to implement a mandate now to do MRI prior to biopsy for prostate cancer. And this gives us a commercial opportunity to introduce software that does that better. And that aligns very nicely with the need to help relieve the burden on healthcare systems and give patients access to better care.
Okay, so how is prostate cancer treated, and how does early diagnosis relate to treatment, would you
Um,
say?
yeah, so it's easier to start at the other end. Cancers progress. Usually starting very small, but as they grow and mutate, eventually they will metastasize and spread throughout the body. It's really difficult to treat metastatic disease because it's diverged evolutionarily, and you end up essentially with medicine against evolution. So we can blast it with drugs, we can treat it with radiotherapy, but unless you can somehow miraculously eradicate every single cancer cell, there's always a risk of it coming back. Now, if you find it much earlier, when it's confined to the organ, much smaller in extent, there's actually a lot less of it. It's less developed from an evolutionary perspective. And if it's local, you can actually treat it much more easily. So surgery or focal therapies or radiotherapy can essentially go and take out just the cancer, potentially leaving the rest of the organ untouched. That has significant benefits for a patient in terms of reducing the side effects of the treatment as well, clearly, as reducing the risk of the cancer recurring. And it's usually a much simpler and cheaper procedure as well from a health system perspective.
And the treatments for prostate cancer are in a way, a bit scary for many men as well, I think. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so the first line treatment for prostate cancer until now has been surgery. It's scary for men because the studies like the National Prostate Cancer Audit in England highlight that there are quite serious rates of side effects like erectile dysfunction or incontinence that can both be quite enduring, and for men who might have to live 10, 20, 30 years with those conditions, those are quite scary prospects. There is an increasing range of treatments now available. And a cool thing is that if you can find cancer much earlier when it's much more restricted in its extent, all of the options get better. So surgery can can cause far fewer side effects if you know where the cancer is and you know that it's not spreading to particular blood vessels or nerves that are at risk. And if we've got good visualization, then some of the newer therapeutic options like focal therapy, such as HIFU, high frequency ultrasound, which is used to essentially ablate or fry the cancer locally within the gland, those will become potentially available. So imaging and finding the disease early really gives doctors the best possible options to treat a patient in the way that's locally available, but that absolutely minimizes those side effects.
And hormone therapy is very common for prostate cancer too, right? Which also has side effects which might scare a lot of men as well, right? Can you say something about that too?
So I think I'd rather pass on that one. I'm really not an expert in hormone therapies. There's certainly one option, but I'd rather not
Yeah,
go into that.
sure. Okay, so what are the main challenges that you faced in developing your business? Could you tell us a little bit about the story of Lucida Medical?
So we founded Lucida Medical now about 3 years ago. We is myself and Professor Eva Sala, who's the Professor of Oncological Imaging at the University of Cambridge. And our goal was to commercialize this software that I introduced earlier. Um, we really hit kind of one key challenge to start with, which was raising investment. COVID certainly didn't help, but medtech is seen as a slightly unfashionable area in the investment community, which I think is, I think it would merit more attention than it's been given. There are lots of opportunities for creating patented IP, lots of opportunities for differentiation and value, and in a way we can, we can create companies that are well worth investing in. We had challenges raising investment. COVID certainly didn't help, but in 2021 we were lucky to be able to close investment from a tremendous group of investors who've been enormously supportive of our work. Now the company's going forward. Um, uh, to be honest, one of the things that slowed us down most has just been hiring. We have been able to find some really great people, but it has taken quite a lot of time to get them. It's a very buoyant job market, and if you're bright, know some maths, and are interested in computers, I can very strongly recommend artificial intelligence as a space to get into, because your career prospects would be very rosy at the moment.
So, could you say something about where you are as a venture? How close are you, for example, to having a product which is actually in clinical use?
So that's a great question, and a key one for all medtech companies. We're quite lucky because this is software and it's used in a way that's actually very safe. It's used to assist radiologists, so there's always a clinician overseeing what the software does. We were able to get our first CE mark regulatory approval last year, and we have a pipeline of further regulatory approvals underway. And we've been lucky to already have had the opportunity to prove the software working in a simulated clinical setting in partnership with the East Midlands Imaging Network, or EMRAD, and GE Healthcare. And that's given us a real impetus. It's shown that radiologists like the software and that it's possible to integrate it technically in a way that's very usable. We're now working with a group of leading doctors in both NHS, public healthcare, and in private practice, to start trialing the software in their own clinical pathways. And at the same time, we're building further clinical evidence by running ongoing clinical studies to, really provide additional justification for using the software and make it really clear that it's both safe and effective.
So, when would you expect to be having your software out there in clinical use, in real
We're
clinical use?
we're working to complete that this year in 2022.
Fantastic. Okay, so what are the main challenges and difficulties for companies in this kind of area trying to get their products approved?
Um, so I think let's talk firstly about regulation of medical devices, because actually at the moment one of the biggest barriers is medical device regulation in Europe, and we're seeing quite a few companies actually go to the US first because the regulatory landscape can be significantly easier, especially if somebody else has already tried to crack a similar problem before. In Europe, the introduction of the medical device regulation in 2017, it came into effect last year, does make the process rather more complicated. But the biggest challenge there has been that it's overloaded the notified bodies, like BSI, who are responsible for doing the approvals. So companies large and small are currently facing a bit of a backlog of introducing medical devices through that approvals pathway in Europe. And it means it's actually one of our strong suits because we completed our first approval last year. But I think that approval is a prerequisite and is something that slowed people down. The next challenge is really getting the decision makers to accept that this software, even irrespective of whether it's got an approval, whether it's actually good and cost effective. And there our focus is really to make sure that, as well as having the necessary regulatory approvals, we cover three key areas. You've got to provide a patient benefit, you've got to have cost effectiveness, and you've got to make it as easy and frictionless for hospitals to integrate your technology as possible. And historically, companies have often come from a perspective of developing algorithms, but have not necessarily focused on those areas. And it's really important that you do right from the beginning.
Okay, so could you describe how your software would work? How would a radiographer use it, and what would come out of that use?
Yeah, sure. So with Lucida's software, a patient is referred for investigation and diagnosis of prostate cancer, just as they would be today. The first thing that they have is a PSA blood test and an MRI scan. The results of both of those two are fed into our software, which analyzes the images and the test results, and is able to identify, firstly, whether the patient has an overall risk of cancer, and secondly, if there are any potentially cancerous lesions that ought to be considered by a radiologist and other clinicians for biopsy. So the end result is we're giving radiologists everything they need in terms of images, 3D models, risk scores, and a template report that they can then use to complete their report, take that to their clinical colleagues, and decide whether a patient needs a biopsy, and if they do need a biopsy, where to target in that biopsy. The results of that will then determine whether the patient needs treatment and how best to treat them.
So, to come back to my first question, is there any evidence that you've gathered which indicates that the success of the system could outperform that of a human radiologist?
The first key thing to say is that the software doesn't need to outperform a human in every application. To make a clinical pathway more effective and safer and more cost efficient, you often only need to solve particular problems. In our case, we're targeting in a sense, a problem that's the easiest to describe, which is how do you find which patients are normal and don't actually need a biopsy and don't need treatment? And that's quite easy to describe. It's actually technically quite difficult to achieve in practice. But the early results that we found so far indicate that we have very high negative predictive value in the kind of high 90s percentages. And what that means is that if the software says that it thinks a patient is low risk, it's very likely that a radiologist would agree, and it's therefore really safe for the software to be used as part of a pathway where your first decision is which patients can I send home now and reassure them that they really don't have cancer. But by doing so, you might be able to cut the workload for the investigation and treatment by a factor of 2, 3, potentially significantly more, and save quite a lot of money in terms of the healthcare resources and free up a lot of clinician time so that they can focus really on what they enjoy most, actually, which is helping patients who've actually got disease.
Okay, so I'm going to play devil's advocate now. Okay, Anthony. Now, PSA, you mentioned that you take in patients who've had a PSA test. Now, PSA is prostate specific antigen, right? And high levels of PSA tend to indicate possible prostate cancer. And then at the same time, an MRI of a prostate might show a tumor that might be perfectly visible to the naked eye, or certainly to a radiologist. Now, I'm kind of wondering whether a trained radiologist who knows what a healthy prostate should look like would be able to do the same thing, and he would also know that high PSA values increase risk as well. So my question is your system doing anything that a human radiologist couldn't do? Is it doing any? How is it adding value exactly?
So that's a really great question, and how it adds value. Firstly, radiologists are terrified about missing cancer, and we know that they do. A Cochrane meta-analysis of 8 major clinical studies showed that radiologists find about 85-86% of prostate cancers, which mean they're missing cancer in 14 or 15% of patients. And if we can help reduce that gap by just helping them avoid accidentally overlooking something, we can really make a significant difference. Secondly, it's really difficult to rule patients out because in practice, normal is a continuum, and cancers can often look quite similar to some benign conditions. It's not easy for a human to consistently make those judgments, but an AI that can be trained on thousands of cases and operates in a completely repeatable way has potentially got an opportunity to do better. The last thing we can do is we can really fuse information in a way that a human can't. We can look at all of the MRI images at the same time. We can look at subtle image features, and we can look at the clinical history, and really focus the algorithm on making a decision that's optimal in a way that a human never would be. And I'm going to make there's one further key point, which is that the goal here isn't to make an AI that replaces humans at all. It's just to make the humans more productive and allow them to concentrate on the interesting clinical challenges rather than the routine stuff. What we've been told clinicians love about our software is that it gives them it highlights the areas of suspicion that they need to look at, which makes them a bit reassured, and where patients are negative, they've got the calculations, they've got the volumes, so that they can see that there are no areas of risk, and it helps them, and ultimately I think it will help them reassure the patients that these individuals don't actually need further investigation.
Okay, so how do you see imaging AI evolving in the next 10, maybe 20 years?
It becomes just a routine part of clinical practice in the way that ECGs used to be read by hand 25 years ago. Now a computer looks at them and can tell you the heart rate, can identify a whole range of abnormalities completely automatically, and then that allows us to move on to analyzing more relevant clinical questions. One of my favorite example AIs is in the cardiac space. Actually, it's a company called HeartFlow who've developed algorithms that can kind of look right down into individual coronary arteries to help diagnose a range of problems, and by doing so actually save patients from dangerous and very costly investigations that they might otherwise have to undergo.
Okay, all right. We've got time for one last question, and that's about ethics. Do you see medical AI in general as involving ethical risks? And if so, what do you think those are?
There are kind of two key areas where there are ethical risks in AI. There are ones about health equity or equality, and there are ones about safety. And I think we've now got a better handle on the safety risks. Medical device regulations actually really great at characterizing risk, and now thanks to the MDR, we've got new safeguards, so algorithms have to be monitored in the field. But there are potentially more subtle risks where individual patient groups, for example, who might be at higher or lower risk of disease, might not be appropriately considered by an algorithm. And I think from our side, we already have something of an understanding of those risks, and we're already putting in place the processes to continue to monitor how our algorithms are used in clinical practice, so that we can make sure that we're not, in some sense, advantaging one group over another, and overall to make sure we're delivering all of the patients whose healthcare condition is assessed with our algorithm, make sure we're giving them the best possible care.
Do I wonder whether in the discussions that we tend to have about the ethical risks of AI, medical AI, we sometimes miss the idea that there are ethical risks with not having medical AI. This never really gets talked about, but we've developed a technology which could save lives, and if we really put the brakes on it because we're worried about the risks, we are missing the fact that there is a big opportunity cost to that kind of reticence. Is that true?
Yeah, no, I think so. And the status quo is often the most dangerous thing. And not introducing a medical intervention can often lead to a real real harm. And we all have a duty, when thinking about healthcare, to keep an open mind and consider what's ultimately going to be best for patients, and most cost effective for healthcare systems. Back to prostate cancer, there's enormous regional variation in the quality of care for it. The expertise to interpret these MRI scans is not widely available. And if we can help narrow that equality gap, we'll actually end up bringing a large proportion of the population up to a level of care that today they might only achieve in the best academic centres.
Fantastic. Anthony, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. We could talk all day long, and maybe we will have a part 2 and we will get to explore the things we didn't manage to today. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
And thank you, Felix. It's been a real pleasure, and I really hope the listeners enjoy this conversation and a few insights into what AI can achieve in the real world.
Fantastic. And good luck with all the work that you're doing this year.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye then. Thank you for listening. I'm Felix Beacher. Ping me on LinkedIn for more information on Omdia's services in healthcare technology. See you next time.